Korea's very own space rocket Nuri is scheduled to shoot for the stars for a third time next Wednesday, and this time around Nuri will reportedly seek to carry a commercial-grade satellite into space. So what is the significance of this upcoming endeavour? Why is the timing of the third launch different from that of the previous launches? And how many more launches are expected for Nuri? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we discuss Korea's planned third launch of its domestically produced Nuri space rocket. For more on this, I have Professor Paul Yoon at the Camino College live on the line. Professor Yoon, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good to see you.
I also have Kwon Soa here in the studio. Soa, welcome.
Always great to be here.
Right, so let's start off here in the studio. Let's begin with some details about the preparations for next week's launch of the Nuri space rocket.
Right, around a week is left until the planned third launch of Nuri, or the Korea Space Launch Vehicle 2, the formal name of the homegrown rocket that's got the mission to put practical satellites into orbit. So May 24th, next Wednesday, is D-Day for now. Nuri is going to carry 8 satellites, which have all arrived at the Naro Space Center in Goheung, Jeollanam-do Province, around 2 weeks ago. And since last week, the assembling process has started. The significance of the third round is that an actual satellite with Earth observation capabilities will join the journey. Professor Yoon will give us more details on that later on. According to the Ministry of Science and ICT, by the 21st of May, Nuri is expected to be fully assembled and then loaded on a special vehicle and transferred to the launch pad on the 22nd. Earlier in April, the first and second stage assembling process were said to have been completed, and now the third stage is getting prepared, which is where the 8 satellites are being loaded. Various performance and launch safety control tests have or are also being carried out, and those involve 11 organizations, including local government officials, the military, and police. On the eve of the launch, so the 23rd, when the rocket is erected on the launch pad, it'll go through final verifications, which includes electricity, fuel supply, and other mechanical functions.
Right, and all that being said, Professor Yoon, what would you say is the main mission of this third launch of the Nuri space rocket?
I think this one, just unlike a previous first two, which is a kind of carry out the performance verification satellite. This is the time actually Nuri third launch carry practical commercial grade satellite, I think, which is a pretty significance.
And apart from that particular difference, Professor Yoon, do you see any other differences between this upcoming launch and the previous 2 launches that we've had?
Yes, ma'am. The first of all is it is actually carrying the practical and then commercial grade satellite. Also, I think very importantly is, unlike the first 2, it's involving commercial partner. And just NASA involving many commercial partners such as the SpaceX. This time, Korea government involving Hanwha Aerospace, which is a very good directions for future Korea's space industries. And also, I think this time they're carrying satellite manufactured by Korean private companies. To be competitive in the space industry, there needs to be a heritage. So this time, Korean companies' satellite will be tested in space environment, which will prove the market that its products and services are functioning properly, which will be good for Korea in the long run.
Right, I see. So the previous launches took place at 4 p.m., I believe, and this particular launch that we're looking ahead to for next week has been scheduled for 6:24 p.m., if I'm right. Why is that?
Yes, good observation. The test launch in November 2018, the first launch in October 2021, and the second launch in June 2022 were all scheduled for 4 p.m., although the first launch was delayed for an hour to 5 p.m. But this time, the third launch has been decided to be carried out at 6:24 p.m. The launch time is determined based on the type of satellites that the rocket carries, their missions, and which orbit they are put into. There's a suitable amount of sunlight that's needed for an optimal performance. Also, the number 2 next generation small size satellite that we mentioned earlier is to perform its mission at an altitude of between 500 and 550 kilometers. So the time has also also been set with regards to minimize the possibility of collisions with other space objects. And in case of any checkups that might be needed at last minute, the launch could be delayed for around 30 minutes. However, the Ministry of Science and ICT and the Korea Aerospace Research Institute, which are in charge of the project, plan to stick to 6:24 p.m. as much as possible.
Right, and also, so could you tell us a bit about the events that are poised to occur once blastoff takes place?
Right, so let's say that the launch does take place at exactly 6:24 p.m. In that case, 125 seconds after Nuri's takeoff, the lowest stage is separated. Then the fairing and second stage are detached one by one. The fairing or payload fairing is an equipment that protects the rocket and the third stage during the early boost phase, as aerodynamic forces can affect the spacecraft. Now, 783 seconds or some 13 minutes after the rocket takes off, the next Sat-2 will be separated. That's the satellite we spoke about before. From then on, every 20 seconds, 7 satellites will be freed in intervals. The JAC, the Lunar T1, the KSAT-3U, and 4 SNIPE satellites. Some 19 minutes after the flight, it'll be determined whether the launch was a success or not. And from then on, what will be the satellites be doing? So Korea's second next-generation small satellite, the next Sat-2, is the one with the mission to capture high-resolution images of the orbit, which will use so-called X-band radar technology to measure space radiation for 2 years, orbiting at an altitude of around 550 kilometers. And the others are 7 CUBE satellites that'll also be in charge of Earth observation, space radiation measurement, demonstration of space waste reduction technology, and identifying near-Earth plasma structures.
Oh, I see. And staying with that, right, they really have a lot of mission ahead for them. Professor Yoon, what more can you tell us about these satellites and their upcoming mission?
Just Soa explained so well, so I just want to add a few more things. Right, so I think as Soa pointed out about next generation small satellite, which is what it's capturing high resolution images regardless of weather condition, which means during the night or whether there's a cloud, rainings, you can still capture very clear images, which is going to be very practical application for many areas. Furthermore, I just want to add 4 CubeSat developed by KASI, Korea Astronomy and Space Science Institute. They are first time, I guess this is the first time in history. I think they are doing the flying information, which means they're flying at the same time to study space weather. That's quite noticeable.
Right, I see. Good to know. So the conventional wisdom is that practice makes perfect. And that being said, do these particular words, you believe, explain the repeated launches of Nuri?
Well, according to what the Korea Aerospace Research Institute says, yes. Now, following the first 2 launches, with one of them partially succeeding, the second one ending in a success, however, having deployed dummy satellites, and now the third one, which we'll know more about in a little more than a week from now, the project already has its 6th launch scheduled. So we're going to have the 3rd one next week, and then 3 more already planned. So that will be the 4th one in 2025, the 5th in 2026, and the 6th launch in 2027. So what that means is, regardless of whether the launch fails or not, the focus will be on increasing the success rate through repeated launches. And other advanced countries have improved performance and reliability through repeated launches as well, is what the organizers here say. So yes, Korea also plans to raise its reliability of projectiles by optimizing and stabilizing the process through repeated launch operations until we do get perfect in it. And also, according to KARI, the institute, it's necessary to meet the demand for satellite development in Korea, and the government plans to expand the scope of the private sector in future Nuri launches.
Right, I see. Professor Yoon, how many launches do you advise and why with regard to space rockets?
So I explained pretty well. Korean government is planning for 4 additional launch, including next week launch. I think that's good enough. If it goes well as planned, that should be good enough to prove that Korea has a launch capability and the payload operation. I think that's going to be good enough.
Right, I see. So 6 launches in total then. And so what looks to be the greatest variable to any upcoming launch?
I would say Mother Nature, because
course.
it's always difficult to predict the weather way beforehand when the date of launch is decided on. And also me as a former weathercaster have to say that it's always difficult. But end of May weather usually is pleasant. It's not the monsoon season yet. It's not too hot, not too humid. But this being said from a human perspective. Now for Nuri, what matters in particular is the wind factor. And that not only on the level we feel, but also the wind high up there. In fact, winds are stronger the further you go up. And according to researchers participating in the launch, rain is not really a big problem. It does not need to halt the launch, but lighting along with rain could become an issue, and that because for the safety of the workers on ground. So the speed of the wind will be thoroughly checked in the morning of the launch. That'll determine the launch time or even day. And as I said earlier, the launch could be postponed or also pushed forward for around 30 minutes. But beyond that, the organizers would rather postpone the date itself. Now, the Nuri Launch Committee has set a time frame of May 25th to 31st, keeping unfavorable weather conditions or other issues in mind.
Right. Professor Yun, so we are now counting down roughly about a week to Nuri's 3rd launch. And all that being said, what are some of the remaining tasks ahead, do you think?
As Soa pointed out, I think weather might be a factor. I know that the so far first stage and second stage is kind of put together. Now, all the 8 satellites, their environmental tasks must be completed by now, I assume. And then once that's completed, they'll be mounted to the 3rd stage, and then all stage 1, 2, 3, we put them together, and then make sure, it's always important to make sure that everything is all done right. Then, once the weather is good, then I think Korea started counting 3, 2, 1, and then lift off the Nuri rocket.
And we'll keep our fingers crossed, of course. So, meanwhile, what are some other interesting aspects with regard to this upcoming launch?
Well, apart from the fact that this time we're focusing on the practical satellite mission, not just the actual launching of the rocket, for the first time, Hanwha Aerospace, chosen as a private partner of the project, is participating in the launch, which Professor Yoon also earlier mentioned briefly. The firm managed production and helped in preparing for the 3rd launch. More specifically, Hanwha Aerospace is in charge of growing the project into a system integration company that's able to oversee the entire launch process. So this is also in line with what I mentioned before on the government's plans to expand the private sector's role in upgrading Nuri. And Hanwha Aerospace will be taking part for the upcoming launches until 2027 as well.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Yoon, moving ahead then, what can you share with us about Korea's lunar probe Nuri and its latest images of craters on the moon?
I think the world is watching, and the world is finally relying on the science information that Korea is providing. That's, I think, very significant. And then the amazing images about lunar valleys and craters, that could be very astonishing. And the future mission of the Korea's lunar mission, but also NASA will use this image for preparing the future mission. So I think that's very significant.
What more can you tell us, Professor Yoon, about Korea's mission with regard to the moon? When are we planning to put a man on the moon, do you think? Or what are the prospects with that regard, with that ambition?
That's a very good question. Last month, the President Yoon and the Vice President Harris met in the Gaba Space Flight Centers. Korea is planning to go to the moon. President Yoon says Korea will go to step on the moon by 2045. And I think it's very aligned with the NASA's mission to go to Mars too. So I think, let me clarify, yes, President Yoon talks about going to the Mars by 2045. This is very close to align with the NASA's plan to go to Mars around that time. So if Korea is work closely with the United States through the Artemis program, I think the chance to succeed is very likely.
Right, and expanding on what Professor Yoon has just said, Soa, Korea and the U.S. have signed a space deal. This was signed during President Yoon Suk-yeol's state visit to the U.S. in late April. Could you tell us a bit more about the agreement made?
Sure. So envisioning a space alliance, South Korea and the U.S. have agreed on deeper cooperation in outer space. The Korean Ministry of Science and ICT signed a joint statement with NASA that agrees on cooperation in space exploration that will solidify partnerships in space communications, navigation, and research on the moon. Also, as Sunny mentioned, the pact was agreed during President Yoon Suk-yeol's state visit to the U.S. last month, where he made a tour at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. And President Yoon there voiced his hope for CASA and NASA to begin joint research and development programs as partners and establish communication channels for active exchange of people, information, and knowledge. CASA is the acronym for Korea Aerospace Administration, and I believe Professor Yoon will tell us more about that.
Right, actually, maybe he should. Right, Professor Yoon, so Korea, as Soa has just mentioned, spoke about setting up its own version of NASA called CASA. What are your thoughts on this venture, and what are some of the essential factors to consider?
I think this is maybe what I think the NASA might be a good example. So by studying what NASA does, Korea can learn about how the future, the Korea space mission could be proceed. So yes, closely watch what NASA does. And then also President Yoon point out, and then Vice President point out, strong collaboration between two nations. Then through this collaboration, I think naturally Korea Soa, Space Soa, the agency will be formed appropriately.
Professor Yoon, at this particular point in our discussion, I'm going to give you another impromptu question. Many do question about the importance of space exploration, especially given the challenges here on Earth with regard to climate and poverty, of course, disease, and so forth. What do you say to these people?
Space exploration is a way to solve. I think the Vice President Harris point out pretty well. She emphasized multiple times during the meeting with the President Yoon and that got us the flight space centers that we are facing a climate crisis. So I think through utilizing the space, we could more proactively respond our climate crisis at this point. So I think I hope that Korea has a very advanced the satellite manufacturing. Also, Korea has a launch capability. Korea's role will be more, I think, more increased in this our human effort to try to deal with this weather crisis.
Right, I see. And so, meanwhile, what more have officials here shared with regard to our upcoming plans of setting up a space agency similar to NASA?
Right. Good that you mentioned upcomings, because I thought maybe some of our viewers might think CASA already exists, but it is in the planning to be established, and it's one of the ambitious plans of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. And something interesting in regards to the payroll system for people or officials that will be working at CASA is what an official mentioned. The salary cap is expected to go beyond that of public officials, and there is probably going to be some incentives in regards to officials that work there and make technology advances and so forth. And the agency, therefore, may also become a kind of model organization for structural reform in the public sector, is what the leader of the preparatory team, in fact, said. And once launched, it's going to pave the way in making South Korea become the 7th space power in the world, is what officials are hoping for.
Right, I see. Professor Yoon, I hear space tourism can become a reality as early as this year. Could you tell us a bit more about this prospect?
That's right. I think interesting is about behind my screen. There's you see the ISS, International Space Station. The ISS will be planned to be retired by 2031, and that will be replaced by commercial international space stations. So I think that'll be I think important part of the destination for the space tourism too. So NASA is pointing out, NASA tried to commercialize space. We are relying on this commercial partner, and NASA says commercial partner come up with some idea that you could commercialize the space so that you could sustain, you could make a profit. Tourism is definitely important ingredient of the commercializing space. So I'm pretty sure it's going to be continually growing. And then I think a few years later, within 10, 20 years, I think a lot of people will travel space.
I actually have a question to Sunny. Would you actually be wanting to make travel to space if it gets commercialized all over the world?
I would actually love to travel. Unfortunately, though, I have claustrophobia. So I don't think I can make a space trip. So if you had to abandon Earth and go to space, I would have to stay here. What about you?
For me, I don't think I could afford it.
That's a good point. Meanwhile, Professor,
can I add one more?
Yes, of course.
Sonny, don't worry about it. You know, you could fly, right? I think it's going to be just like taking a plane to going one place to the other. So I think you'll be fine. Also, the cost, I'm pretty sure by economy scale, the price will go down gradually so that more people can travel.
Good point,
It'll take
Professor.
time,
We'll
but
keep our fingers crossed for
affordable.
that, right? Hopefully.
That's what I think.
Right. One more question, Professor, before we let you go. Very brief question. Amid these advances in space technology, there are concerns about the space debris out there. What do you have to say regarding that? Very briefly.
That's another problem. I think in the past, we just used something, we just leaders. We didn't have a chance, we didn't know how to clean it up. But now we are more conscious about cleaning up space environment because we are sending out more stuff. If all the space debris, they are traveling really fast. If you collide, it's going to be very disastrous. So I think now on, we need to make a satellite which is more user-friendly. One of the actual satellite launched by this third, the Nuris, has a capability of bringing the CubeSat at the end of the lifespan coming back to the atmosphere so that it kind of clean up itself so that it doesn't become a debris in the space. I think that's very important. So now on, in future space exploration, I think we are more to be environmentally more conscious, and then we have to continue to work together to reduce the space debris.
I see. Well, it's good to know that. All right, Professor Yoon, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
And Soa here in the studio, thank you very much for your input today.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Do join us again same time tomorrow. That is Wednesday. Thank you for watching.